even if they aren't living in a tiny house, right? A lot of people got forced to live tiny in general, all across the world. And there was a desire, I think, for so many people to have some nature indoors.
Welcome to the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast, the show where you learn how to plan, build, and live the tiny lifestyle. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and this is episode 166 with Leslie Halleck. I was really excited to invite Leslie on the show because she has just published a book called Tiny Plants, Discover the Joys of Growing and Collecting Itty-Bitty Houseplants. And I just knew I had to have her on to talk about plants that you can bring with you into your tiny house lifestyle. I had no idea that this was even a thing, so I'm really excited to share this conversation. Leslie is a super outgoing and knowledgeable guest, and she actually brought plants for show and tell. And so members of Tiny House Engage were able to actually watch our interview stream live. But she has also sent me some photos of the plants that we talked about in this episode. So if you want a visual on the things that we covered, you can check out the show notes for this episode, which is going to be thetinyhouse.net/166. I hope you stick around. I want to tell you about something that I think will be super helpful as you plan, design, and build your tiny house. Tiny House Decisions is the guide that I wish I had when I was building my tiny house. It comes in 3 different packages to help you on your unique tiny house journey. And if you're struggling to just figure out the systems for your tiny house, like how you're going to heat it, how you're going to plumb it, what construction technique are you going to use, like SIPs or stick framing or steel framing. Tiny House Decisions will take you through all these processes systematically and help you come up with a design that works for you. Right now, I'm offering 20% off any package of Tiny House Decisions. For listeners of the show, you can head over to thetinyhouse.net/THD to learn more and use the coupon code TINY at checkout for 20% off any package. Again, that's thetinyhouse.net/THD and use the coupon code TINY for 20% off. All right, I am here with Leslie Halleck. Leslie is a certified professional horticulturist who has spent her nearly 30-year career hybridizing horticulture science with home gardening and houseplant enthusiast needs. Leslie runs her own company, Halleck Horticultural, and is a UCLA Extension horticulture instructor and the author of several books, including Gardening Under Lights, Plant Parenting, and her latest release, Tiny Plants. Most importantly, she's a big plant geek. Leslie Halleck, welcome to the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast.
Hey, thanks for having me. I'm so excited to talk tiny today.
Me too. Anytime I see somebody who's like writing or talking about something tiny, especially if it's something that could go in a tiny house, I'm like, I gotta have them on the show.
No, I was just gonna say, I don't think anything is sort of a better companion than sort of tiny living, tiny houses, and tiny plants. It really is kind of the perfect combination. So I'm glad we found one another.
Me too. So I wasn't, to be honest, I was not aware that tiny plants were even a phenomenon until somebody approached me about doing an interview for another podcast that is about humans growing things, a podcast that's about plants, to talk about tiny plants. And I ended up roping in my brother who works for a nursery in Portland. But anyhow, you were on the same show, and that was the first I had really heard of tiny plants. So can you tell me about like the background of the tiny plants phenomenon?
Well, I mean, I think in terms of a trend or a phenomenon, I'll take a little bit of responsibility for directly pushing that on everyone because I'm just personally, I have a penchant for petite plants, and an affinity for alliteration. Fun. But I will, yes, I do tend to push it. I have an origin story. If you get a copy of my new book, Tiny Plants, I preface the book with sort of the origin story of how I came to become obsessed with itty bitty plant species. And I want to be clear that in this book and in terms of what I'm talking about when I talk tiny plants, I'm not talking about artificially managed plant species, right? Like us through human intervention keeping them small. I'm talking about genetically natural itty bitty tiny plant species that coexist with much larger plant
Hmm.
species out in the natural environment. And just like we do with traditional tropical houseplants, there are all sorts of itty bitty tiny species that one can cultivate indoors, just on a much, much smaller scale. But they're often overlooked. And I think when the pandemic hit and everybody was sort of forced inside, confined in small spaces, even if they aren't living in a tiny house, right? A lot of people got forced to live tiny in general, all across the world. And there was a desire, I think, for so many people to have some nature indoors. And hence a new cycle of houseplant craziness
Yeah.
has ensued. Those cycles come and go, and we're in another one right now. But for folks that have discovered that those philodendron and monstera get massive in size, much bigger than they thought they would, they're getting crowded out by their plant collection now. So tiny plants are really kind of the perfect solution to whether you live in a tiny space or you want to keep growing a collection, but you're out of room because of your bigger plants. Tiny plants are the perfect way to grow.
I love it. So I want to dive into that more. What tiny plants and where, but what are some examples of larger plants that can be kept artificially small? Can you do that to any old house plant, or are there only certain ones?
Well, sure. So I think that most people are familiar with the concept of bonsai,
Sure.
right? Which is really the art form of miniaturizing traditionally shrubs and trees, right? Artificially in very small, shallow containers and pruning them very aggressively over years to sort of mimic, right?
Hmm.
A large outdoor species and specimen in a small contained environment. So that would be one way that we artificially keep plants small, just general pruning, right? You can just prune plants continuously, which is kind of like bonsaiing them to keep them small and compact. When you get into the commercial world, you get into things called growth regulators, right? Those are chemicals that you can spray on plants to essentially inhibit their natural growth
Hmm.
habits. You can keep plants temporarily, sometimes permanently, artificially small through those means. So, you know, those are not the types of plants I'm talking about in my book. I'm talking about naturally miniature plant species, right? That this is how they grow in nature. This is how you find them in nature. So certainly you can prune down all sorts of plants, but in reality, there's only so much you can prune back that big philodendron or monstera. It's still a big leafed foliage plant. It's only so small that you can keep it.
Yeah.
However, there are miniature species of philodendron, very tiny, that probably most people have never seen or heard of. So if you're into aeroids and you're into some of the bigger cool tropical plants, but you want them on a smaller scale, that's what I'm trying to introduce you to in this book.
Awesome. So where can people go to find these tiny plant species? Because I'm guessing that since you said they're often overlooked, maybe they're a little bit harder to buy in your local garden center.
Yeah, for sure. I think that if you read the preface in the book, I talk about sort of my jungle work and travels and research that I was doing that sort of led me to stumble upon some micro orchids, which are a particular fascination for me. And from that, I started building a lot of terrariums and vivariums. I kept poison dart frogs and many other herps for many years. And so when you keep those types of animals, you build really specialized environments that we call vivariums. And you have to start searching for tiny plant species that work for those species of animals and in those small contained environments. And where you find yourself shopping and hunting are with growers that are sort of outside the traditional garden center plant vendor world, if
Hmm.
you will. Not to say that you won't find tiny plants at your local garden shop or plant shop. Most of those you will find will be cacti, which are very popular.
Right.
And there's lots of tiny species that I talk about. Those will be easy for you to find. But when you start getting into the tropicals, the higher humidity species, ferns, orchids, you have to search a little bit harder which I think is part of the fun. The hunt for these cool plants is part of the fun, but one of the things I've done in the book, in the back, in the resource section, is actually introduce you to a lot of my favorite specialty vendors that grow and sell really itty bitty tiny plant species, from foliage ferns to aquatics to micro orchids. Because if you're shopping sort of in the general plant world, you're not going to find a lot of these plants. So getting out into some of the aquatics vendors, the vivarium vendors, places like that are where you're going to find some of these really cool tiny plant species that you've probably never seen before, and you've probably never seen offered at your local garden center
Right.
or plant shop.
I have a memory as a kid. I don't know, maybe I was 7 or 6, and somebody gave me a tiny little cactus plant that I kept on my windowsill. And I think I got bored with it because I was disappointed that it wasn't growing very quickly.
Right. Actually, I have and for those listeners who actually also go online and look at the video, here's a really tiny Haworthia. It's one of my favorite. And this is actually a pretty large colony of Haworthia. And this is about as big as it gets. And so, yeah, if you're looking for plants that are going to grow super fast and ramble,
Mm-hmm.
obviously your teeny tiny succulents and teeny tiny tropicals aren't going to do that. But if you don't have a lot of space and you have a corner of a desk or a tiny windowsill in a tiny home that gets bright light, a tiny succulent like this is perfect because it's never going to outgrow its space.
Right. So that's going to stay in that little pot kind of forever.
Yes. Indefinitely. I could divide it and split it up into new pots eventually as this cluster. For those that are viewing, it will kind of start to push it out of this. When I know it, I can split it, divide it, propagate it,
Mm-hmm.
which I have a book on propagation, plant parenting. You can check that out. That goes into all of that.
Okay.
Yeah, I have that one here. So if you're into propagation, plant parenting, I show you how to divide succulents, which would be the same procedure whether it's a tiny plant or a bigger one. But yeah, that's going to live pretty much indefinitely in that size container. So it's pretty handy if you don't have a lot of room.
Awesome. So thinking about the setting of a tiny house, you've got
right.
A 200 to 400 square foot home with probably a lot of windows, so a lot of natural light, but probably not a lot of like counter or not a lot of spare horizontal storage space.
Right.
Can you talk about how to creatively kind of fit these plants into places where you maybe don't have a spare corner of a desk because your desk is like multifunction? It's got to fold down when you're not using it, that kind of thing.
Right. So I think in terms of pots that you might want to sit down, on a tiny windowsill or any little area that you have that's a surface area. The great thing about a lot of these tiny plants is the relative size of their pots. I mean, many of these plants I grow in 1-inch containers, 1 to 3 inches. I think 2.5 inches is about the maximum. So, you can have, a great little fern. Here's what I'm showing on the video, in a 2-inch pot that is pretty leafy, doesn't take up much space at all. And many of my tiny plants, grow in 1-inch pots. You barely need any space for a lot of these plants, but you can also grow vertical. So a lot of these plants can be hung. So kind of a great solution for that. If you have a lot of windows and a lot of diffuse bright light, maybe not quite enough for a lot of succulents. That is the challenge that most indoor growers run into with succulents and cacti is that, without a good 5 hours of direct sunlight, it can be tough to maintain those.
Okay.
But a lot of bright, diffuse, indirect light is perfect for most foliage plants and a lot of tiny gesneriads like African violets and begonias. And you can hang those tiny pots. I don't know, if you're into tiny houses and tiny living, I suspect that some of you may also be avid DIYers. I make my own little, macrame or whatever wire plant hangers all the time. And you can retrofit any little, hanger, or you can make one to actually go vertical with your tiny plants. And to even make it easier, you could certainly even get into air plants or tillandsia, which I don't really cover a lot in this book because there's so many other great tillandsia books, but that's a really easy way to grow vertical. So if you've got some areas that you can hang some things in front of a window, that's perfect.
Nice. You hit on something that's actually a great thing to ask about, which is DIY and repurposing.
Yeah.
Because that is a big part of the tiny house movement, especially for people who are building their own houses. Do you have any kind of creative ideas for what you can put your tiny plants in? I mean, beyond, your obvious, like an extra mug that you have laying around or something like that. What are some creative things you've seen?
Well, that's sort of one of the great parts about growing tiny is that you can repurpose so many different things. I mean, down to really the size of a thimble. You can reuse to grow like a lot of microsyningia that I grow are so tiny. The root system is so small. All you need is a little something the size of a thimble. So really any vessel that you have, can be used to grow many tiny plants. I mean, like you said, whether it's an old, tiny, coffee cup or, a discarded little bowl, broken pottery, reclaimed wood. There's just so many ways that you can use materials. And and you'll see some of that in the book. I have a problem, an acquisition problem with vintage glassware. So you'll see that a little bit reflected, in the book. But the cool thing about, like, for example, growing under glass, like here's an example of a little microgramma fern that I keep in a pot that just grows in this little glass jar. I also use canning jars. Like, that's a great thing to repurpose, are just, jelly jars, canning jars. I keep a lot of tiny plants inside or covered with just a glass or canning jar. So there's a lot of dishware, glassware that you just may already have that you can repurpose for keeping a lot of these tiny plants in high humidity, conditions, or to create vessels with drainage. Certainly doesn't take as much resources as bigger plants. You don't necessarily have to buy big expensive pottery. So there's tons of things you can use.
Nice. So some people travel quite a bit in their tiny homes, particularly people who are doing, vans or school buses.
Hmm.
What are some plants, or are there any tiny plants that are maybe better than others if you are traveling a lot? And so the light isn't always going to be consistent. Temperature could change quite a bit. Do you have any suggestions there?
Yeah, I mean, I think if that's the situation, it also depends on the kind of light and windows that you have. If it's variable, or maybe you don't have as many windows, you're in a van situation, then you're definitely want to go with lower light specimens, right? So, you're probably not going to want to dive into full sun highlight succulents, for example, because that's going to take a lot more light. So you're going to want to stick with lower light foliage. So if you look in the book, I kind of split up the plant profiles that I give you into windowsill versus under glass. So the plants I give you that are for the windowsill are going to be the easier plants to care for
Mm-hmm.
generally, right? They're not going to be as sensitive to humidity. They can dry out more. They'll be a little bit more tolerant of very light conditions, especially the foliage. The non-blooming species are
Okay.
just not going to need as much light. So, yeah, some of the succulents that I gave you, like Haworthia, like that little Haworthia that I showed you, that is actually one succulent that is pretty low light tolerant. And so I would say that Haworthias in general would probably be one of the perfect sort of groups of succulents that are super easy to care for. If you're a forgetful waterer, they can go for a long time without water, but they tolerate more water than many other succulents.
Mm-hmm.
So it's harder to kill them with overwatering, like a lot of your other cacti, and they'll tolerate low light. So I would say if I just kind of had to pick one genus of plants or hybrids or cultivars thereof, Haworthias are kind of perfect for that situation.
Cool. And are they hard to find?
No, actually, because succulents and cacti have been so popular
Yeah.
in the last 10 years, there are tons of vendors. And you'll find in the book, I recommend there's a few succulent specific vendors that I recommend. And you will find that Haworthias also have had a real boom in popularity the last few years. So you're going to be able to find tons of varieties, many species of Haworthia of different size ranges, many natural varieties, as well as many cultivars. There are quite a few hybrids between, aloes and Haworthias. There's another genus called Haworthiopsis. Those are really great. So that's probably a really great place to start for anybody that's tiny home, especially mobile, is check out all the tiny Haworthias because I think that those are gonna be some of the easiest to care for. They're also incredibly small, so you're really looking at those 1 to 2-inch pot sizes is kind of all you ever need.
Yeah. Yeah. I'd like to tell you a little bit more about Tiny House Decisions, my signature guide, and the resource that I wish I had when I was building my tiny house. It starts with the big decisions, which is, should you build a tiny house yourself or with help? Is a pre-built shell a good idea? Is a house on wheels better than on the ground, and what works better for you? Deciding on the overall size, deciding on whether you should use custom plans or pre-made plans, different types of trailers, and more. Then in part 2, we get into the systems. So heat, water, showers, hot water, toilets, electrical, refrigeration, ventilation. And we're only 2/3 of the way through the book at this point. From systems, we go into construction decisions, talking about nails versus screws, SIPs versus stick framed versus advanced framing versus metal framing. We talk about how to construct a subfloor, sheathing, roofing materials, insulation, windows, flooring, kitchen. I know I'm just reading off the table of contents, but I just want to give you a sense of how comprehensive Tiny House Decisions is. It's a total of 170 pages. It contains tons of full color drawings, diagrams, and resources. And it really is the guide that I wish I had when I was building my tiny house. Right now, I'm offering 20% off any package of Tiny House Decisions using the coupon code TINY when you head over to thetinyhouse.net/THD. That's THD for Tiny House Decisions. Again, that's coupon code TINY when you check out at thetinyhouse.net/THD. So one thing I'm trying to figure out how to ask this because I don't know this firsthand, or I guess I've seen articles,
Okay.
I've seen like news stories talking about how the explosion in like air plants and all these like tropical plants is resulting in, like habitats and environments being kind of strip mined for their air plants or kind of just impacted heavily. How I never thought I would ask, like, how can I make sure that my house plants were ethically sourced?
Yeah, so it's interesting. Plant poaching is a thing, and that's what we call it. And so it really kind of, I think, I mean, there have been many cycles of this throughout history, right? Of
Mm-hmm.
natural landscapes being ravaged, of plants, orchids, anything that becomes popular, explorers have over harvested. And that's true across many plant segments. I would say in the last 15 years or so, with the boom in succulents and cacti has really put a lot of pressure on natural environments. California, you'll find, has a really big problem with plant poaching, with native succulents and cacti being harvested. So, you're really looking for growers who ethically source their plants and grow their own plants. They're not harvesting in the wild.
Ah,
Now, with a lot of the aroids that have become really popular, philodendrons, monstera, anthuriums, all of those kinds of plants, this has become big business in, Southeast Asia. So there's a lot of plant poaching now going on there. So I would say be careful with who you buy from, do your research, check them out, send them an email and ask them, how do you source your plants, and are you propagating and growing your own, or are you, harvesting? And so it really, the same thing goes with reptiles and herps, right? If you're keeping any sort of pets like that, the same goes. You want to make sure that these are not wild collected animals, right?
right,
That these are captive bred, that conservation is a part of that business model.
right.
So, yeah, you want to make sure that the folks you're buying from are not harvesting. So I will say in the current plant boom, there's a lot of people going overseas for their plant purchases. That is where you're going to be taking that risk. So I would suggest buying domestic,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there are also a lot of growers shipping plants from overseas that are not necessarily taking care with biosecurity. So diseases and pests, can come in on those plants, and that's actually a really big problem.
Right.
So, be thoughtful about how you buy, buy local, buy domestic for the most part, and just do a little bit of research on that vendor.
Yeah, you don't want to be the person bringing in the like Dutch elm disease of tiny plants.
Yeah, and I'll say, and I will say this sort of again, the new houseplant boom has brought about a lot of new hobbyist growers that
Yeah.
are just growing and selling out of their houses, and many of them are simply just not experienced or aware about those things, and don't realize they have to have a license. You have to, depending on what state you're in, need something like a nursery floral license, and that means the USDA can inspect your nursery stock. They can inspect your business anytime they want, and that's for a reason. That's so we can cut down on transmission of very destructive diseases that could be a problem for agricultural crops. So yeah, I mean, it's good to be informed about all those things for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, thanks for filling us in. And there are real parallels there to the tiny house industry where there has also been a huge boom, and there are a lot of builders who are building tiny houses who not all kind of know what they're doing.
Well, I think that is anytime something becomes popular, right? All of a sudden you get a lot of newbies flooding into the market
Mhm.
who may or may not be offering product in a way that is backed up with a lot of experience and knowledge, or maybe the right type of certifications or the right licenses. So, I mean, this is living material that can impact any natural environment. You have to be careful about invasive species. So, yeah, you have to do your research, learn about the plant you're buying, who you're buying it from, just like you would if you're trying to be sustainable and responsible when you're building a home or a tiny house
Mhm.
or anything really.
Well, one thing that is cool about the DIY spirit of the tiny house movement is that people can really customize their homes, um, you know, to suit their interests and activities. Like I've seen a few different tiny homes that have climbing wall features, either inside or
Right.
outside. Tiny houses that have a jacuzzi tub because the person loves taking baths or things like
Right.
that. So I'm curious if you, Leslie, I don't know what your feeling about tiny home living is, but if you were forced to live in a tiny home, would there be what special features would you insist were built into that home to support your plant parent lifestyle?
My plant parent lifestyle, my plant, habit. Well, so I would probably take cues from some of the things I've done in my not tiny house, which is basically growing vertical. I have reclaimed a lot of things like dumpster pallets and whatnot to build integrated wall shelves with lighting in them, low profile, small wall shelving that fits in my kitchen that I actually have grow lighting mounted in,
Mm,
so it doesn't take up a lot of space. It grows vertical, but it allows me to grow some things in a very small space near my kitchen. So I would probably look at creating some vertical wall units that were, shallow, low profile, but that I could put in grow lighting that would allow me to grow tiny plants or herbs, that are within reach, right, from the kitchen, or that just, augmented the space visually. So I would definitely be looking at sort of how to pocket plant my tiny house, if you will, by using wall space creatively, ceiling space creatively. And then probably what I would do if I was gonna get a little more technical would be maybe to use a small sliver of space that might be refrigerator space as a little bit of a growth chamber, great way to grow microgreens and things like that in a tiny artificial environment. So I would probably focus on some of those things.
cool. And that actually, you've brought up a great point that I hadn't even thought of is that, these tiny plants don't necessarily just have to be aesthetic. They can also be for eating.
Sure, sure. I mean, yeah, you can, this in tiny plants, they wanted me to focus specifically on house
Right.
plants, right? Because it's such a huge top. And I was limited on space in this book, right? So, I mean, I could have gone on forever, but
Yeah.
it's a tiny book on tiny plants. And so I had to limit my plant choices. But certainly there are, I mean, there's so many thousands of teeny tiny plant species, thyme, the herb, thyme is a great
Yep.
example. there's some incredibly micro varieties of thyme that, don't even grow barely an inch. I mean, not even a half an inch tall, can
Yeah.
be kept in very small pots. So low profile shelving with some grow lighting. I mean, you can maintain some small culinary plants as well.
Yeah.
There's a lot of new micro veg out on the market.
Micro veg.
What I call micro veg. So I'm an intensive indoor grower, right? So my other book, Gardening Under Lights, I go way into that for anybody who's looking to grow intensively indoors. I
Okay.
go into lighting and grow lighting. And the challenge with growing edibles indoors is often their size.
Right.
You know, tomatoes are big plants. I mean, peppers can be big plants, eggplants are big. And so in the last few years, there's tons of new dwarf cultivars that stay tiny, micro tomatoes that are under 8 inches tall, tiny peppers, tiny micro basil. So you can also pocket plant with grow lighting
Hmm.
in a tiny home with micro veg and herbs.
Cool. Now, so I feel like I've seen advertisements for little kits or like their little tiny grow setups that come with some starter
Sure.
seeds and you can grow like some herbs in your kitchen. Are there any of those that you recommend?
Up until recently, most of there's a lot of false advertising around a lot of those. Anytime you see one of those grow units that's got LEDs and it's generally about 20 watts or
Hmm.
less,
Hmm.
and the image has like these big beefy tomato plants with a bunch of ripening fruit on it, that is photoshopped. So the reality is there's just not enough light quantity that's going to be generated from a unit like that
Hmm.
to achieve those results. Now, I would say in the last year or so, there have been a lot of improvements in output for LED grow
Okay.
lighting, and some of these units are now starting to put out a higher quantity of light, which can better support fruiting, right? So leafy greens and herbs
Hmm.
don't need as much light quantity as something that fruits. So, lettuce and leafy herbs are much easier to grow in those types of contained grow units. So I would say they're getting much better, but up until now, I could pretty much look at most of them and say, not enough light, not enough light, not enough light.
Okay.
Plants are going to be leggy, they're not going to fruit, so you're really looking for a higher output of light quantity, essentially, and then, matching that with what you're trying to grow. Are you growing leaves? Or are you trying to grow fruit?
Right.
So I dive way more into that into gardening under lights if you really want to geek out on that.
Okay.
It's a big topic, but yeah, I would say that if you're going to buy a new self-contained grow unit with grow lights, a little small countertop unit,
Yeah.
you're safe growing some leafy greens, some lettuces, some small herbs, maybe try the micro dwarf basil. You could even try some of the micro tom tomato, tiny cherry tomatoes. Don't try to grow big, slicing tomatoes in those.
Yeah. Well, the cherry tomato plants can get huge too.
Yeah, so you have to look for the micro
Right.
tomatoes.
Micro tomatoes.
Not even just dwarf, but look for micro tomatoes, and there's quite a few new cultivars out on the market now. So if you're gonna do that, stick with the micro tomatoes, miniature vegetables, miniature basil, because basil, they always show those in those units, but the basil always outgrows the size of those
Yeah.
self-contained units. They want to flower really bad.
Yeah.
And they just outgrow, and then the foliage gets burned because it's touching the light. So you got to stay tiny.
Okay. You got to have your own little bonsai garden of basil.
Yeah, micro everything. I mean, those tiny house, tiny growing unit, tiny plant varieties.
So would your book Growing Under Lights kind of teach me how to start growing microgreens on my counter?
Yes.
Cool. All right.
Yes. Well, yeah, I go in gardening under lights. I'm gonna dive into some plant science 101, which all of my books do. So I
Mhm.
always try to teach some plants science so that you understand the why behind how plants are growing and what it is
Mhm.
that you have to
Mhm.
do. So I'm going to teach you all about how plants use light. I'm going to teach you all about how to understand artificial grow lighting. And then I I outline a bunch of different crops, edible and ornamental, in the book, and how to grow those. Yeah,
Cool.
and there's info on microgreens as well.
Cool. Do you have a favorite plant?
This is always the worst and best question, right? Because as a professional horticulturist, how can I pick just one plant? And on any given day, my answer might change, right? From one day to another, I might have a different favorite plant. In terms of tiny plant, I love living stones, lithops. Super cool, super cute, and I'm a little partial to them. There's a lithops Leslieii, so I have my namesake plant, and I have seed that I have of all different varieties of lithops Leslieii. I love micro orchids, but I mean, gosh, it's so hard to pick. I love so many different plants, so it's tough to choose.
Ooh, yeah. I'm not gonna press you to choose, but that's a good answer.
It's like, which kid is your favorite?
Right.
All of them.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, but I call myself an everythingist. I love everything. I'm a huge outdoor gardener. It's funny, all of my books or kind of central theme is indoor gardening techniques. That's what the publishers have come to me and asked me to do. My master's degree is in indoor greenhouse production environmental controls, so that's a natural fit, but I'm an intensive outdoor horticulturist and gardener. I'm a big vegetable gardener. I keep chickens, bees, fruit trees, perennials, roses. I mean, I grow everything. So I am the opposite of a horticultural snob. There's nothing that's off limits to me. I love everything. I grow everything. And you go through phases.
Yeah.
Of different things that you like. I mean, I've gone through 100 orchid phases. I've gone through bonsai phases. I've gone through vivarium building phases. I've gone through obsessive rose collecting phases, bulbs. I've had a huge bulb problem, So, I mean, on any given month or year, I have sort of a new rotation of plant obsessions. And tiny plants, I just kind of felt like it was prime time with kind of the last year and a half and everything that's gone on, and everybody's sort of, living in more confined ways and potentially more mobile, like wanting to be more mobile, that growing tiny is really a way that you can still live with nature and keep growing, but do it on a scale that works for you, small or mobile.
Nice. Well, Leslie Halleck, thank you so much for being a guest on the show today. This was really fun. I learned a lot.
Yeah, I'm diving into your blog. I'm actually looking at some land off and on myself and trying to decide, do I want to buy a house or do I want to build a tiny house? So I'm definitely going to dive more into all of your blog and your content, and maybe bug you with some tiny house questions. Yeah. And you can bug me with tiny plant questions.
Get in touch. Whatever you need. I guess my advice is don't build anything right now if you can.
Right.
You can wait, because
it's expensive.
The cost of building materials is insane. Have the cost of plants gone up during the pandemic?
The plants, yes, the cost of plants definitely have. There's a supply chain issue as well.
Yeah.
So supply and distribution, it's kind of put pressure on everybody across the spectrum.
Yeah.
And so, plant shortages are kind of a thing. Obviously, demand is way up. I know that some of the community has been concerned about raising plant prices, but I will say, as somebody who's been in the industry for almost 30 years, plant prices have really been way too low for a really long time. I don't think people realize how little growers actually make off of years of growing a plant before it gets to you.
Right.
So I will say that there's some necessary price corrections that have needed to happen.
Sure.
But if you get into like plant auctions, like some of the crazy deep dives, people are paying insane prices for plants, like thousands of dollars for like a cutting of a, particular species of Monstera. I will tell you, as a professional horticulturist, I will never do that. I will never do that because it's too risky. These plants can be really tricky to grow. So yes, there's definitely plant inflation, but I think that as we get over the next year or two, some of that's going to level out.
Right. And it sounds like if you have some friends who are also interested in plants or tiny plants, that you could potentially kind of share your plants by dividing them or propagating them, and then not have to buy lots of plants.
If you get my book Plant Parenting, I teach you how to do it. That's a great way. I love green giving. I'm really sort of like holiday consumerism, like makes me itchy, kind of gives me a rash. I just like that consumption of so much stuff around gift giving and holidays. I find excessive. Plants, I think, are a great way to give green. And so, yeah, I definitely encourage that. The only thing I will say is that, be careful when you're mailing or sending plants across state lines. You have to be really careful about what you're sending, make sure it's clean, stuff like that. But
Yeah.
I think local plant swaps with friends and other enthusiasts are great. I was actually doing a bunch of plant swaps before the pandemic shut everything down. Hope to do some tiny plant swaps soon when things kind of open up in a better way. But yeah, sharing cuttings or divisions or swapping plants is, I think, a really awesome way to sustainably support your plant habit.
Nice. I think we'll leave it there. Leslie Halleck, thank you
Okay.
so much for being a guest on the show.
Thanks for having me on, and it was great to visually meet you.
You too. Thank you so much to Leslie Halleck for being a guest on the show today. You can find the show notes, including photos of the plants that Leslie and I talked about, links to all 3 of Leslie's books, and more at thetinyhouse.net/166. Again, that's thetinyhouse.net/166. Well, that's all for this week. I'm your host, Ethan Waldman, and I'll be back next week with another episode of the Tiny House Lifestyle Podcast.